I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Thanks for joining us on this very chilly night. You know, our program is part of our Center for State and Local Leadership. It's a center which, although it usually focuses on public policy, always remains aware that there are some things, actually a lot of things, that are better done outside of government through the work of social entrepreneurs and the support of generous philanthropists. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce William Schambra, this year's Simon Lecturer, and the fourth in a distinguished series, which has included City University of New York historian David Nassau, the biographer of Andrew Carnegie, Thomas Tierney, founder of Bridgespan, the nation's leading consulting firm for nonprofits, and the Institute's own Heather McDonald. I'd like to extend our special thanks to the William E. Simon Foundation, represented here tonight by President Jim Pearson and co-chair Peter Simon, for its support for both this series and our annual Social Entrepreneurship Award program. One of our past winners, Adam Green of the South Bronx Youth Program, Rockin' the Boat, is here tonight joining us. This year's Simon Lecturer, Bill Schambra, has served for many years as part of the Institute's selection committee for our annual awards program, and I've come to know him there as a thoughtful and principled colleague, deeply versed in the history of American philanthropy and charitable enterprise. Bill's own work is centered at the Hudson Institute in Washington, where he heads the Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. A few words about its work. I doubt that I would inspire too much disagreement in this room by saying there's not all that much about cultural life in Washington, D.C. that should inspire too much envy on the part of New Yorkers. Not the theater, certainly not the restaurants, and definitely not the architecture. But there's at least one exception, and that's the series of forum events that Bill runs at the Bradley Center, a speaker and debate series which explores the most subtle issues of philanthropy, public policy, and civil society, and does it better than anywhere else that I'm aware of. Just consider some of the titles of their recent events. Is philanthropy a profession? Should it be? To the Rescue, Foundations Grant Making and its Response to the Financial Crisis. Too Close for Comfort, Obama and the Foundations, or Creative Capitalism, Can It Meet the Needs of the World's Poor? Through the combination of his own writing, such as his regular columns in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and this outstanding series, Bill is framing the central issues for philanthropists, nonprofit organizations, and their government regulators. Tonight, he will bring his analysis, informed by history, to the contemporary social entrepreneurship movement, and particularly those who see the new generation of nonprofit leaders as representing a sharp and justifiable break from what we might call America's Tocquevillian tradition of effective but mainly small and local charitable enterprise. William A. Schambra is, as I said, the director of the Hudson Institute Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. Prior to joining the Institute in January of 2003, he served as director of programs at the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee. Before joining Bradley in 1992, Bill served as a senior advisor and chief speechwriter for Attorney General Edwin Meese III. He was previously director of social policy programs for the American Enterprise Institute and co-director of AEI's A Decade of Study on the Constitution. As an appointee of President Reagan, he has served as a member of the National Historical Publications and Records Commission and as an appointee of President George W. Bush as a member of the board of the Corporation for National and Community Service. He's written extensively on the Constitution, the theory and practice of civic revitalization, and civil society in the public interest, public opinion, the Wall Street Journal, and as I said, his regular column for the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Please join me in welcoming Bill Schambra.
Well, thank you very much, Howard, and thank you all for indeed coming out on a nippy evening here. I'm deeply honored and grateful to the Manhattan Institute for the opportunity to deliver a lecture named for William E. Simon, whom I never met myself, but I had the honor of working for some of his students and beloved friends, in particular Jim Pearson and Michael Joyce. And I hope I absorbed some of the lessons that Bill Simon had to teach us about how to do philanthropy well. This is a particularly propitious moment to reflect on the future of social entrepreneurship. For over the past several months, one of its proudest achievements, the microfinance industry, has sailed into some very rough waters. Ever since microfinance's founder, Muhammad Yunus, received the Nobel Prize in 2006 for his work with the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, he has been, in the world's imagination, the exemplar of the social entrepreneur. His is indeed an inspiring story. A charismatic figure works tirelessly to transform the world with his visionary idea. In this case, the conviction that the poor can work their way out of poverty through small loans to support their own village micro-enterprises. Since then, a veritable macro-enterprise has sprung up to locate, study, nurture, and replicate similarly inspiring figures. It has spawned countless university programs, books, journals, articles, and consultants, all aimed at refining the theory and practice of social entrepreneurialism. Over the past 2 years, though, further analysis has taken some of the bloom off the microenterprise rose. Researchers have found that many of the microloans don't fuel enterprise at all, but are rather used by the poor to address immediate food, health, and education needs. No wonder then that the aggregate impact on poverty in places like Bangladesh seems to be negligible. And then 2 months ago, a grave challenge arose to the vast microfinance industry in the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh, where authorities sought to end what they considered to be its harsh practices. Interest rates were too high, it was said. Loan officers from multiple lenders pressured villagers to take multiple loans and then bullied them when payments were late. The resulting downward spiral of indebtedness ended for too many in suicide. There is another side to this story, however, and it's every bit as inspiring as the legend of Muhammad Yunus. Vikram Akula, a native son of Andhra Pradesh who grew up in the United States, has devoted his life to extending microcredit far beyond the limited number that could be funded by miserly international donors. He insists that the only place you can get the amount of money that is needed to help the poor is in the capital market. When his organization, SKS Microfinance, went public this past August, it raised some $358 million from wealthy investors, including George Soros. But critics, notably including Yunus himself, denounced the profit-making approach as exploitation rather than relief of the poor, an argument that no doubt fueled the hostility of the Indian authorities. This complicated story is still unfolding, but it allows us to understand this central point. For all its popularity, microlending is built over a deep and treacherous fault line between the demands of compassion and capitalism. This does not daunt the social entrepreneur of the literature, however, for his champions assure us he is a veritable colossus bestriding the narrow world, or at least bestriding the boundaries separating compassion, capitalism, and politics on the way to revolutionizing entire social systems in order to get to the root causes of our problems. If this sounds utopian, it is. And in that utopianism lies the central problem of social entrepreneurship. Consider the inflated expectations raised for it by its leading promoters. David Bornstein maintains in a book tellingly entitled How to Change the World that social entrepreneurs possess powerful ideas for attacking social problems and are unwilling or unable to rest until they have spread their ideas society-wide. Bill Drayton, founder of the Ashoka Fellows Program, notes that the social entrepreneur in the core of his or her personality absolutely must change an important pattern across her or his whole society. Indeed, cannot stop until he or she has changed the whole society. J. Gregory Dees adds that social entrepreneurs are reformers and revolutionaries with a social mission. They make fundamental changes in the way things are done in the social sector. Their visions are bold. They attack the underlying causes of problems rather than simply treating symptoms. In Paul Light's words, social entrepreneurship focuses on changing the underlying dynamics that create the demand for services in the first place. Instead of treating society's distress, social entrepreneurship holds hope for eliminating the distress altogether. Attacking the root causes of social problems, particularly poverty, means to many observers that social entrepreneurs must become masters of the marketplace as well as the nonprofit sector. As Dees and Beth Anderson argue, we should focus on social entrepreneurs who carry out innovations that blend methods from the worlds of business and philanthropy to create social value. How have efforts to blend business and philanthropy worked out? Well, not so well, according to Stephanie Strom of the New York Times, who likens the hybrid to Dr. Doolittle's fabled push me, pull you. Sooner or later, it seems, the uneasily conjoined profit motive and social motive come to blows, and one or the other is driven from the partnership. Social entrepreneurs typically tackle this utopian admixture with very little sense of just how rigorous and demanding the marketplace can be. In 2005, William Foster and Jeffrey Braddock surveyed nonprofits that had undertaken so-called social enterprises and found that 71% of them reported being unprofitable. And of the remaining 24% reporting profitability, half were not fully accounting for indirect costs. The authors concluded that the lion's share of earned income ventures do not succeed at generating revenues beyond their costs. Two fairly recent institutional failures illustrate the difficulty of reconciling social and marketplace principles. In the late 1990s, and with the applause of the social entrepreneur community ringing in its ears, the Nature Conservancy decided to put its considerable nonprofit resources behind an environmentally conscious commercial venture on Virginia's Eastern Shore, a classic triple bottom line venture meeting economic, social, and environmental ends all at once. It included dozens of business startups, an eco-friendly waterfront development of homes and farms, and a 12-room inn built around an historic lighthouse specially barged in at the cost of $3 million. In spite of the massive spending and even more massive hype, the project went belly up in 1999. An analysis by the Ford Foundation, one of the disappointed investors, concluded the fact is that very little is known about how to create enterprises that meet the triple bottom line. More recently, one of social entrepreneurialism's favorite project, one of their favorite projects, Chicago's famous Shore Bank, failed as well. Its motto was, "Let's change the world." As an article in Fast Company noted, the news was quite depressing to many people across the globe, for Shore Bank had come to represent the enduring success of capitalism serving the needy through commercially viable lending in low-income communities. That is, it captured perfectly the combination of compassion and profit that social entrepreneurship values. But after the collapse of the housing market in Chicago, Shore Bank could not bring itself to foreclose on its many troubled loans as the marketplace, but not social purpose, would have demanded. One bank analyst posed this query: was this bank managed as well as it could have been, or were they too much into the social welfare thing? A former board advisor suggested that Shore Bank suffered from an overly zealous commitment to its original mission. Again, it seems that reconciling banking and the social welfare thing, or market and charitable principles, is not as easy as social entrepreneurialism's definition suggests. It is also possible, of course, that market principles might come to displace the charitable impulse. This is precisely the charge brought by Muhammad Yunus against Vikram Makula when he condemns SKS Microfinance for reversing Grameen Bank's original subordination of profit-making to poverty fighting. Another much admired social entrepreneur, Martin Eakes, similarly condemns commercial lenders for swooping into the subprime mortgage market with toxic products after his North Carolina nonprofit had helped him create a national market for non-conforming loans. In both cases, social entrepreneurs claim that they created markets for social purposes only to find the market principle morphing into a monster and swallowing the initial charitable impulse. It seems that social entrepreneurs may indeed stride boldly across sectoral boundaries, but only to trigger powerful market forces over which they have no control. We see once again that markets and social purpose make for an unstable compound, which even the most skilled social entrepreneur finds it difficult to maintain. Social entrepreneurialism's sector bending is not confined to its relationship with the marketplace, however. It also has its eye on the realm of public policy. Knowing that government is typically the most dominant and wealthy player in its area of interest. In former presidential advisor David Gergen's words, if you could unite the energy, ideals, and innovativeness of social entrepreneurs with the resources of government, you would have a powerhouse. So over the past 2 years, many of America's leading social entrepreneurs, including City Year, America's Promise, Teach for America, and Youth Villages, have come together in an effort called America Forward to attract government support for their efforts. America Forward, too, is a sector bender, arguing that by connecting all sectors, government, business, nonprofit, academia, and philanthropy, we can garner the human and capital resources to solve some of our country's most pressing social problems. Arguing that government should be organized effectively to identify innovation, invest wisely, and release civic energy, America Forward's efforts culminated in the establishment of the Obama administration's Social Investment Fund. But this effort to marshal government resources behind entrepreneurial initiatives has yet to answer a question posed recently by Manhattan Institute's own Howard Husick. Why is it likely to end up any differently from the countless other joint ventures between nonprofits and governments undertaken over the past half-century? We know that in the past, government has frequently reached out with its money to capture the flexibility and innovativeness of social entrepreneurs. But as Stephen Smith and Michael Lipsky point out in Nonprofits for Hire, along with the funding came reams of regulation that effectively strangled the very entrepreneurial qualities it sought. As with social entrepreneurialism's flirtation with markets, so with its foray into politics, it is likely to quickly become entangled in considerations for which it is ill-prepared. Social entrepreneurialism's cross-sector ventures at first sound so appealing, so sensible. Let's combine the efficiency of the marketplace and the resources of government with the compassion of the nonprofit sector, keeping only the good qualities of each while leaving behind the bad qualities. Whenever we hear that glib formulation, though, we should suspect that it's born of utopian wish rather than realistic expectation. In the real world, such blends seldom preserve only the virtues while avoiding the vices, even if they're engineered by world-beating social entrepreneurs. We're just as likely to end up with the resources of charity, the efficiency of government, and the compassion of the marketplace. Now, social entrepreneurialism believes its utopian aspirations are radically new, but in fact, they are mere echoes of the first enthusiasms of America's modern philanthropists at the turn of the 20th century. John D. Rockefeller himself claimed early in the last century that, as he put it, the best philanthropy is constantly in search for finalities, a search for cause, an attempt to cure the evils at their source. Charity would only put Band-Aids on problems, he said, while philanthropy would solve them once and for all by getting at their root causes through the new sciences of society that it generously funded. Just as with today's social entrepreneurs, the early foundations did not hesitate to stride boldly across sectoral boundaries in their determination to transform entire social and economic systems. The Russell Sage Foundation, for instance, experimented with social enterprise when it tackled early on a substantial market-oriented housing project at Forest Hills Gardens with predictable results. And the Rockefeller Foundation partnered very closely indeed with government when it funded the salaries of federal officials to promote scientific agriculture and of southern state officials to promote the development of high schools. Yet after a full century of aspirations to solve social problems in this grand trans-sector fashion, today's social entrepreneurs can arrive on the scene, look about them at the evident lack of progress, and conclude that surely such aspirations must be altogether new and peculiar to themselves. 100 years after John D. Rockefeller proclaimed the need to transcend charity's Band-Aids in order to cure evils at their source, Paul Light can proclaim with all the enthusiasm of discovery that instead of treating society's distress, social entrepreneurship holds hope for eliminating the distress altogether. Today's social entrepreneurs follow modern philanthropy's unfortunate path in yet another respect as well. The progressives who staffed the first foundations believed that social affairs could be handled efficiently and objectively only if taken away from everyday citizens and put into the hands of professional experts trained in new scientific techniques. Today as well, we are asked to place an inordinate amount of trust in a handful of charismatic, sector-bestriding colossi to solve our social problems. In Paul Light's words, we should try to identify potential social entrepreneurs, give them the training and support they need, and increase the odds that their work will succeed. Scholars of social entrepreneurialism are even confident that it can be distilled into a set of professional principles and practices. Indeed, in Bill Drayton's view, social entrepreneurship needs to be the first worldwide operationally integrated profession, presumably, like all professions, open only to the select few. The determination to professionalize and elevate the role of social entrepreneurialism bespeaks the same elitism we found in the early progressive philanthropists, a quiet contempt for lesser beings who address the immediate problems of those directly in front of them through mere charity. In their effort to establish rigorous standards for social entrepreneurs, Roger Martin and Sally Osberg want to distinguish them from efforts that never break out of their limited frame, whose impact remains constrained, their service area stays confined to a local population, and their scope is determined by whatever resources they are able to attract. Millions of such efforts exist around the world, and the authors concede they are well-intended, noble in purpose, and frequently exemplary in execution, but they should not be confused with social entrepreneurship, they conclude. I would argue to the contrary that such efforts represent the real social entrepreneurs. As much as we can and should admire grand figures like Muhammad Yunus, it's a mistake to put our welfare into their hands. The glory of American civil society is precisely that it permits and encourages everyday citizens to build countless smaller, limited, local projects to address the problems immediately before them. This kind of social entrepreneurship, let's call it citizen entrepreneurship, is not a rare, exclusive form of social practice that seeks to revolutionize entire systems at once, or to stride boldly back and forth across the boundaries of philanthropy, the marketplace, and politics. But as Alexis de Tocqueville pointed out many years ago, the sum of countless such efforts spread across the face of society generates an astonishing level of social energy, along the way cultivating the values essential for democratic freedom. Let me frame my some concluding thoughts around one citizen entrepreneur I've come to know and admire over the years, and I met through the auspices of Bob Woodson at the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise in Washington. This entrepreneur is named Bob Cote, and he's the founder and director of Step 13, an addiction program located on Larimer Street in downtown Denver. He had no grand society-transforming vision for Step 13. It was rather a classic manifestation of Tocqueville's self-interest properly understood. One day he simply found himself, a bankrupt businessman, leaning against a building on Larimer Street with a few drops of vodka left in his bottle, staring at his two drinking buddies passed out on the street, realizing that this would soon be his fate as well. He started his recovery in a building nearby, relying on its first residents to rehab it. Over the years, he came to employ what he calls the principle of constructive envy to draw addicts off the street and back into society. They begin at Step 13 with nothing more than a dormitory bed, but with progress and recovery, they work their way up into their own cubicles and ending upstairs in their own private rooms. Unlike 30-day spin-dry rehab programs, residents can stay as long as they want to, as long as they need to at Step 13. To be sure, Bob, too, is determined to earn enough someday through his T-shirt screening and auto detailing businesses to be self-supporting. But that's not because he has some grandiose vision of combining compassion and capitalism. It's just that he hates like the dickens to beg money from wealthy donors. As for political engagement, the last thing Bob wants is government funding. At any rate, Denver's larger professional recovery programs would never permit it. After all, he has a stringent zero tolerance policy, while the latest fad calls for providing addicts with all the comforts of home, hoping that they will realize gradually and over time that drinking and drugging may be counterproductive. Bunks for drunks, Bob calls it, so you can imagine why he's not a favorite with the providers. Now, Bob Cote's story can be replicated hundreds of times in Denver alone and tens of thousands of times across America. For this story does not rely on rare qualities of a global professional elite, but rather on the common qualities of everyday American citizens who are drawn into community activity by the modest virtue of self-interest properly understood. This is precisely the sort of effort that Martin and Osberg would wish to exclude from their definition of social entrepreneur. But that kind of exclusiveness is not only patronizing and arrogant, it's also profoundly ill-advised in a democratic political system. After all, democracy persists only as long as most of its citizens have a deep sense of civic agency when they're persuaded that they truly govern themselves. A civil society that welcomes the commitment of civic energies to projects like Bob Cote's contributes to the flourishing of democracy. A social entrepreneurialism based on the cultivation only of the noble select few as agents of utopian systemic revolution necessarily undermines the spirit of American democracy. As Irving Kristol pointed out in a memorable speech to the Council on Foundations 30 years ago, we really have no idea how to produce social good on the scale called for by the promoters of social entrepreneurialism. Our brief look at various such attempts to mash the sectors together in order to get at the root causes of problems only confirms its wisdom. But we do know how to do good on a small scale. Through much maligned charities like the one established by Bob Cote, like the ones that Bill Simon, the late Bill Simon, certainly participated in toward the close of his life in particular, and the other groups, the other citizens that we celebrate each year with the Manhattan Institute Social Entrepreneur Award. We should pursue that small, doable good through our support for the real social entrepreneurs, the citizen entrepreneurs, rather than hoping for grand systemic revolutions by rarefied elites that get us no place. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bill, for reminding me of our own Manhattan Institute definition of this phrase, social entrepreneurs, outside of government, reaching directly, making a difference in individual lives. Made me proud of the work that we've done together, so thank you very much. But let me just, before I open it up to questions from the audience, let me challenge you for a moment. I think that on their best days, this professional class that you would talk about would say, but there are so many people who aren't being reached. When President Reagan announced cuts in government social programs, the rejoinder was the philanthropic sector could never make up the gap, and therefore so many people will go begging for those services. Isn't the impulse of the global that you were skeptical of to reach as many as possible and not to let them go wanting? What do you think?
Yeah. Okay. Speaking of wanting, I'm wanting a little drink of water, if I may. Yeah, that comment about the cutting back, President Reagan's cutting back government programs and philanthropy not being able to make up the difference was of course I mean, as if the object was for government simply to scale back the funding of these terrible programs, and then philanthropy and corporations would flood in to fund those same terrible programs, right? I mean, that was always a kind of a red herring in the argument. There's no question that the impulse to serve as many people as possible is a noble impulse. And indeed, as I say, we're going to see, we're seeing right now a test of that impulse in India, in the state of Andhra Pradesh. I mean, this is in fact an unfolding, I didn't check the news today, but this is a story that's unfolding every day. The state of Andhra Pradesh trying to rein in what they understand to be abuses in the microfinance sector, but with Vikram Akula and others insisting, look, charity and philanthropy alone can't deal with the resources, it can't deal with the needs of the poor. We need these, we need capital markets to come in and assume the responsibility for some of this work. But the question always is, are these in fact manageable enterprises over the long term? Are these grand undertakings in fact really successful? I mean, one of the things that the Hudson Institute has published at the Bradley Center is a book written by Martin Morse Wooster entitled Great Philanthropic Mistakes, and they're not so much disasters, they're just examples of, Lord knows in New York City, of course, you've been subjected to the Ford Foundation's grand utopian schemes any number of times. Certainly the local control in schools, the Ocean Hill-Brownsville controversy, a lot of the early gray areas, poverty work. All of these were grand efforts to make huge differences, at one time, a huge difference at one time, to solve the problem once and for all. That's the object. And it just never works out, because we don't, and Irving Kristol is right, we just don't know how to do good on that kind of massive scale. And as a result, we've wasted incredible amounts of philanthropic resources over the years pursuing those kinds of grand utopian schemes, when in fact those resources could have done immense amount of good for the small, nonprofit around the corner that is doing a terrific job feeding and clothing and providing succor for the poor. I mean, this is the great tragedy. You know, the utopians accuse charity of spinning wheels when in fact they're the ones who are spinning wheels. And we've had 100 years, the irony is we've had 100 years of experimentation with this approach, and we have so very little to show for it. And, you know, even as this sector becomes ever more results-oriented, the irony is, in the grand sense, they have so few results to show for this, you know, this incredible, grand, large-scale attempt to solve problems once and for all. It just doesn't work.
Questions from the audience? I see our Simon lecturer from 2 years ago, Heather McDonald.
Thank you so much for a great talk, Bill. You've posited, I think, several different definitions of the overly grandiose type of social entrepreneur. One definition is sort of a hybrid approach, whether it's combining with market forces or government forces. Then you've referred to it as sort of an elite, and then the globalized nature of its vision. But I'm not sure where the transformative efforts the conservatives tend to back fall into your categories. You mentioned in passing Teach for America. We, you know, gave her an award. I don't know if you would consider that a totalizing or globalizing vision. Vouchers, school vouchers, are an extremely radical change that has very little precedent in the history of American schooling. And the charter school movement as well, I think, has a very global vision and a desire to really shake up public schooling on a very widespread basis, and is not content with simply a very local change. So I'm not sure how to apply the principles you've set out to initiatives that, again, conservatives tend to back. It seems to me they may fall into some of the categories that you're suspicious of.
Sure, yeah, sometimes they do. But let me take the example I'm most familiar with, and you described as the most radical, namely school choice. Because that was something, obviously, that the Bradley Foundation was much involved with when I was with them in Wisconsin. It involves a radical challenge to the system, but unlike all other radical challenges to the system, it isn't just another grand theory of how to do teaching better or how to do education better. I mean, all previous reforms of the system all relied on some new expert who came along with some grand idea of how, you know, you can only teach in open classrooms. You can only teach in classrooms without windows. No, it has to be with windows, you know, in small classes, large class. You know, all of these grand theories of how to change education. And of course, they hadn't worked terribly well. But school choice was basically a kind of a radical agnosticism about the best theory for education. It had one theory, and that is that the parent knows best what kind of education is appropriate for the child. And there is no expert in the world who knows that child better than the parent. I mean, that was really the sort of the foundation for it. So you had, you know, school choice ends up providing funds for Afrocentric schools in Milwaukee. It ends up providing funds for Orthodox Jewish schools, for, you know, Pentecostal schools, Baptist schools, etc. A whole range of schools, as well as all kinds of secular schools, you know, with all sorts of different approaches to education. But it's a grand change, but it is in fact a grand change that returns power to individuals. And it's only a grand change in the sense that it's a challenge to all the failed grand changes before. I think that would be the difference there.
Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone if you would.
Steve Hockman, Manhattan. I'm a big fan of the Manhattan Institute and the libertarian philosophy. I have to take issue with the school choice business. on the theory, what you said, that parents know best. The fact is, parents don't know best. They are not experts in education. And it's been proven that the so-called the charter schools have not proven themselves to be better. Some have. Look, we all know, everyone talks about KIPP. Oh, it's terrific. Now, why is it terrific? Well, first of all, they go to school, I don't know, 50% more hours than the public schools. They are sort of self-directed. The parents who are sophisticated enough to know join the lottery. I mean, the fact is that we need experts, to people who know best. There are proven methodologies for how children learn. It's been proven, for example, in California, who went into the whole language method of reading, that it was a fad that didn't work, and they went from the top to the bottom. Guess what? New York City hired some, quote, experts from a progressive education school called Teachers College, which deals with that. So how...
The question that you posed, which is a great one, which is, we need experts, Bill.
Yes.
You're denigrating.
And you're saying the experts are the parents?
Let's hear what he says.
Yeah, let's hear.
Yeah, I think I think that in the final analysis, there are any number of expert approaches to education, and some work better for some children than others. And the question, that's not the question. The question isn't are there really terrific approaches to education. The answer is yes, there are. And as I say, the question is, but is it best for my child? You know, is this what my child needs? Now that's something that the parent does know a lot about, a lot more than the expert, a lot more than in an exam, you know, a written exam and an hour evaluation by an expert. The parent knows that this child learns better in a fairly strict disciplinary situation as opposed to a loosely organized Montessori type classroom. Other kids, it's exactly the opposite. The question isn't are there good and bad ways of approaching education. The question is who is it that makes the choice? Who is it that knows the child and can choose the institution that's best for them? And as for, you know, charters not being a panacea, you're absolutely right. But the difference is that in a looser charters choice kind of a framework, of course, parents can say after a year or so, this isn't working for my child, and I'm going to take him or her someplace else. I'm going to take my child to try some other approach. And if enough parents decide to do that, right, something radical happens, and that is that the bad school goes out of business, which is something that you know cannot happen in the public education system. It finally is happening. I gather in California they have an option in Los Angeles where if enough parents decide to, you know, the majority of the parents decide to pull their children from a school, they can either radically shake up the administration or close the school altogether. But that's all, of course, in response to the challenge of choice and charters. You know, the system is finally beginning to realize that you need this device to pull the rug out from under these failing institutions. And without that device, you have no way of holding them responsible.
I'm sure you say that the ineffective local charity, to broaden back to our main theme here, would also likely go out of business.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah,
Without
sure.
government support.
No, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Bob James.
Robert James, I'm a businessman here. What is your feeling about business schools teaching students to do what is fair and honest and ethically, socially correct? But to be more specific, wouldn't it have been better if I'd been taught at Harvard Business School to be socially responsible and pay women equally see to it that we didn't buy T-shirts in sweatshops. And there are other things like paid vacations for women and men when they're pregnant, or sell carrots from locally rather than California.
Right.
You know, or use electric cars. Be helpful.
Wouldn't it be helpful? Yeah. Yeah. It was Milton Friedman, right, who wrote the famous article attacking the notion of social responsibility, corporate social responsibility, because of course, as soon as you, as the manager of a corporation, and you decide that you're going to do the responsible thing, i.e. substitute carrots for Snickers bars, you have in fact done the wrong thing by your investors, right? And your first responsibility is to your investors. And indeed, they can bring legal action against you if you put social ends before profitable ends. But that's of course that's a terribly unpopular point of view today. You're quite right that now we expect businesses to behave socially and responsibly and all that stuff. It's interesting. It's my pleasure to have my wife Sharon here with me this evening, and her father established many years ago a concrete company in Northern Virginia, and over the years employed thousands of men and women and Hispanics, African Americans in terrific jobs as drivers and all the associated things that go with the concrete industry. And he did something wonderfully socially responsible. He gave excellent paying jobs with terrific benefits and was immensely loyal to his employees as they were to him for many, many years. That's a socially responsible business, but of course not as it's defined in the way that people tend to think of it today. The free enterprise system entirely on its own and without the mucking around of social entrepreneurs and the social corporate responsibility folks and all the rest of them, the free enterprise system on its own has done incredible things to vanquish poverty, to reduce inequality, to relieve the sufferings of the poor. I mean, it's an incredible system, and the notion that somehow it would be improved if we blunted the profit motive with some random social impulse, I think is probably a dangerous idea.
I'm a producer for John Stossel at the Fox Business Network. I'm wondering, you touched on how microloans have been shown not to work that well. Do you think that now that for-profit companies are getting into it, they'll work better? Well,
this is, as I say, this is a fascinating question, and I really do. I'm really looking forward to how it turns out. I mean, the question is, this Vikram Makula, he's just published an autobiography called A Handful of Rice, if I recall correctly, and it's a terrific book, and he really does make the case that you're not going to get the funds to conquer poverty, through the microloan approach until you've harnessed the capital markets. But it really doesn't look as if the state of Andhra Pradesh or the Indian government is going to permit that kind of thing to happen. They are really just not going to allow it to happen. It really is the limit. In India, you're running up against the political limits of this whole idea. The other problem with micro-lending, of course, and this is a conservative critique of it that I've come across a bit, and I think it's a sensible critique. Historically, lending isn't the way the poor have moved out of poverty. It's been through informal support among family and friends, the family and neighborhood sort of pulling together to provide some money to start an enterprise. It's through savings that then are used to start businesses, that sort of thing. historically, it's just never been the case that lending is the path from poverty into wealth, which even, incidentally, the Gates Foundation has begun to appreciate. They've actually started, in the last month or so, they've announced a major initiative, can't remember how large, to fund savings accounts in poor countries, as micro savings as opposed to micro lending, which is because they have begun to appreciate this is the limit. You know, you can't keep pushing the loans. You know, you in fact have to have some kind of savings, and this is they're going to approach it that way now. Or I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
Let me just press you a bit on that question.
Sure.
You were also drawing the connection between the subprime crisis in the U.S. and advocates for low interest loans or lower interest or easier access to credit on the part of the poor who were coming out of the nonprofit sector. Are you in effect saying that the nonprofit utopians that you're critical of soften things up for for-profiteers who perhaps were turned a blind eye to by regulators or people who ought to be keeping an eye on, or maybe investors flocked in because they were convinced it was a good cause rather than a sound business plan? So are you pointing the finger ultimately back toward these utopians rather than the for-profit?
Yeah, Howard, and I'm glad you brought that up because it was a conversation you and I started, and I wish we didn't have to finish it here, but this is a question. If in fact some of these folks did kick open the door for subprime loans, and they did, right? I mean, there's no question that Acorn and groups like that, community organizing folks in the 70s and 80s, were eager to open the door to what we've come to know as subprime mortgages. The question is, what moral responsibility do they then bear, right, for the situation when, you know, rapacious interests enter the picture and in fact create, you know, toxic situations. Now, in the case of Martin Eakes, right, he's furious at the suggestion that he and others who pushed for the subprime loans in the first place, he's furious at the suggestion that he bears any responsibility for the resulting subprime crisis in general. And in fact, he started something called the Center for Responsible Lending in Washington to fight those. So you could say, well, he did recognize what he had unleashed and then tried to contain it with the Center for Responsible Lending. But I don't know. I mean, once you've changed the equation in a fundamental way, once you've challenged the fundamental notion that a low-income person really should be able to should have some substantial down payment, no matter how poor. They really need to have that down payment as earnest money for their ability to have the house and to keep the house. Once you've challenged that and said, no, the down payment is irrelevant, you know, the credit history is irrelevant, anything goes, then you're kind of responsible for the outcome, I think. At least some moral responsibility adheres to that person, I think.
Yes, sir.
My name is Pete Palmer. Competition is my question. You referred to competition in the California schools as perhaps having some good effects. To broaden that out, would you comment on competition amongst major foundations, charities, and how do we create more competition? It's my impression that a Bradley Foundation or a Ford Foundation does not suffer from a lack of success because they're primarily operating off an endowment. And once that endowment, if it continues to grow, they can grow programs that are not winners.
Right, sure.
So the record of failure that you alluded to should be punished. Really great question.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm doing my best to punish the record of failure by publishing books like Great Philanthropic Mistakes. But as it is a terrific question because it allows me to say this about philanthropy. You know, of course, there isn't a natural mechanism for competition among foundations. But it would be good if we could have honest conversation about philanthropic failures, about the fact that, you know, that the Ford Foundation, you know, has come in and done terrible things to New York City, or that other foundations have pursued utopian projects at the cost of local you know, communities. It's very difficult to tell the truth about those things. Just simply to tell the truth about philanthropic mistakes, about philanthropic missteps, to have an honest conversation about it. Now, I understand there's this move to evaluation, but that's a different thing. Evaluation is a technical process that occurs within the foundation typically. Even if you're hiring an outside consultant, the results are proprietary, they're inside the doors. You know, nobody needs to know about the results. But what we need is an honest public conversation about these kinds of things. I mean, the Gates Foundation recently closed down its small high school initiatives, right? For 10 years, it was absolutely persuaded that small high schools was the panacea for reforming the high school problem in America. So it was going around persuading cities, right, to pool their money as well as, you know, the Gates money into these collaborative efforts to transform the high school systems in these cities to smaller high schools. But of course, that didn't work out terribly well, and after 10 or so years, there was a kind of a comment from Bill Gates. To his credit, he did admit that it was a failure, right? But it was basically, whoops, that idea didn't work. Well, we're moving on now to the next thing. There should have been an enormous discussion about that, and about the fact that, right, everyone was willing to entertain the Gates money in your own community to transform the public high schools without, you know, any kind of serious conversation about the likely consequences of this. And even after it's done and after the failure is apparent, there's a reluctance to have that kind of conversation. So I don't know that you're ever going to get competition in the world of foundations, but it would be terrific to have honest and open conversation about the you know, about what they do and the good and bad results thereof.
And of course, the cutting edge is failure.
Yeah.
In the commercial world, if you don't make it, you fail.
That's right.
It.
That's right.
But
yeah.
in the charitable world, that doesn't work that way.
Yes. No, they can. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Bill Schambra.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.